Our next speaker in the New Work in the Theory of Mind graduate conference here at the University of Bucharest is Ms. Sandra Brânzaru. Her talk today will be titled, "What is Narrative Competence?" And let me just share Sandra's presentation here. And if you could confirm that you're seeing her presentation, that'd be great.
Oh, we can see it.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
It's fine? Okay, great, good. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Just 1 second, because I cannot see the slide.
You can see the slide.
Right. So don't expect a final answer because this is still a huge work in progress. But let me start with what narratives are usually good for. So when we think about narratives, what pops into our heads is usually stories. So we can think of them in terms of entertainment. We have a lot of fictional stories that are available to us in terms of books or movies, series. Narratives are also good for learning languages. Usually when we start learning a foreign language, we start with some basic grammar structures, but then as we further develop our abilities, we get to develop also our ability to produce narratives in that language. And we have to develop also reading comprehension into that specific language. Narratives are also good for cultivating norms. Usually all of cultures have proverbs or fables in which we kind of pack moral messages into a narrative structure because it's easier to recall rather than simply stating a norm. What else these are good for? They're useful in communicating with others. When we talk about how our day went, we will communicate it in terms of a narrative. So I woke up and then I did that and then I did the other thing and so on. They're also useful for sharing experiences. We write autobiographical novels or we simply share our experience in writing or even in pictures or silent movies. So why a narrative and why this should be thought of in terms of a narrative competence? So narrative is a term that has throughout time resisted definitions, but for clarity, I'll refer to a narrative not to a story, where story would be the content of the narrative, but I will refer to it in terms of a structure, which can be used and reused for different stories in order to connect characters, actions, events, goal-oriented behavior, and reasons for acting. Some definitions of narrative include a sequence of two clauses which are temporally ordered such that a change in their order will result in a change in the temporal sequence of the original semantic interpretation. This was Lavov's definition. Herman is actually tried to come up with a minor change and arguing that actually it's a spatial temporal sequence that might change the original semantic interpretation, but I did not include that. Another view is that at least two events must be depicted and there must be some more or less loose but non-logical relation between the events. Crucially, there is a temporal dimension in narrative. Also, there has to be a sustained temporal causal relation between particulars, especially agents, and I will get to talk about those causal relations a bit later. A narrative is distinct from what it is a narrative of. This was Goldie's point, which is a very important one. Stein's definition of story emphasizes a goal or directed episodic structure, and Brunner defined personal narrative as discourse that functions as a pragmatic intention to assert information about self. That may not always be the case. So Brunner is also saying that narrative is conceptual reconstruction of experience. And following Brunner, one can argue that narrative is the first form of discourse produced by children. From a developmental standpoint, it can be considered a discursive unit of two or more contiguous and thematically related utterances, referring to two components of an event occurring in the past or future. But this is going to depend on how we actually conceptualize narratives. So we can have language-based narratives, or we can have non-linguistic narratives. Some would argue that non-linguistic narratives are actually some sort of primers of narratives. So why narratives? Because they seem to be the best way we account for our experiences and how we make sense of them. Because there's been a lot of talk about ChatGPT in the last couple of weeks. Perhaps I should also mention that the primary way that we seem to engage with others is narratively based, but not necessarily language based. Being able to use language in order to produce a narrative, it's easily computable. That's not fairly complicated to do. However, producing a narrative from our experience is a rather complex thing to do, because we have to use several other mechanisms that do not necessarily depend on our ability to produce language. However, developing language abilities does seem to help us make better use of narrative practices, which can lead to a better ability to make sense of others. Stories also have an intrinsically temporal nature. This is consistent with Abbott, who argued that constructing a narrative pertains to having the ability to time travel or for temporal navigation. This allows narrators or readers to move across sequence nodes in narratives. Narrative comprehension, storytelling, and narrative engagement are considered features of human intelligence, according to Engel, and the storytelling skill is based on the ability to mental time travel. Again, there's a lot of emphasis on the ability to mental time travel and to the temporal aspect of narratives. Children start to tell stories at the age of 5 or 6 and start to engage in stories around the age of 2. Humans are deemed to be the only species fond of narratives, and this is usually believed to be related to their linguistic capacities. If one thinks of a narrative as a sequence of connected events, the ability to engage in such sequences can be separated from language, since the sequence can be conveyed through different media: silent movies, picture sequence, symbol sequence, sound sequence. According to Hogan, narrative is causal sequence that refers to a social practice. So here we would have a special kind of a narrative. It can be implicit, non-linguistic, or explicit, linguistic. Dathan argues that there are transactional narrative formats among non-human animals, and narrative competence is based on pre-verbal narrative formats in children as well. According to Rubin and Greenberg, individuals with little to no linguistic abilities can still engage and interpret, understand, or grasp the reasons that narratives are actually based on. And there have been various studies conducted with aphasics and that deemed results which showed that the ability to process non-linguistic narratives is still there. So they cannot process linguistic narratives, but they can process non-linguistic narratives. So this is where I try to explain how this relates to the idea of theory of mind or mind reading abilities, or making sense of other people's reasons for acting. So there's this question: do narratives shape how human process other minds, or do they presuppose an existing theory of mind? One's relation, there are several views, so we'll just go through all of them and I'll try to see where my view is different. One's relation to other depends on a cognitive device that allows for the representation of the other's mental states, their sufferings, plans of action, intentions. It's just this type of mechanism that allows human to acquire a system of moral values and aesthetic preferences. This was Rigaud's view. Humans everywhere interpret the behavior of others in mentalistic terms because we all come equipped with a theory of mind module that is compelled to interpret others this way with mentalistic terms as its natural language. It is hard for us to make sense of behavior in any other way than via the mentalistic or intentional framework or attribution of mental states is to humans as echolocation is to the bat. It is our natural way of understanding the social environment. Both the classic view of theory of mind and the inactivist view consider the role of narratives in social cognition, but they do so in opposing ways. So classic approaches deem narratives to be relevant in theory of mind deficiencies, such as the inability to produce narratives is linked to ASD. Narrative impairments are a feature of autism spectrum disorder. People with autism spectrum disorder tend not to integrate the thoughts and emotions of the characters in the story. However, it is assumed that mental state attribution is necessary for understanding and producing narratives, and ASD is deemed to be the cause. There is some sort of innate module that is not functioning correctly that leads to the inability to process narratives and further raises issues in a theory of mind abilities. And activists argue that narratives actually help us engage with others. They mediate our interactions and help us make sense of their reasons for acting. In terms of accounting for ASD, here we have the exact opposite explanation. So people with ASD present these traits because they do not process narratives. Thus, it is not the case that we have an internal module responsible for our abilities to engage with other minds that's improperly functioning. What we actually have is this inability to properly engage and process narratives. So, but this becomes fixable. It is something that can, it is an ability that can be developed beyond the developmental stage. It's something that even adults can expand. So let's go through all of them, see. But I don't think that we should actually try to find an explanation in terms of fully inferential terms or in fully inactivist terms. I know this is something that some are resisting to, but I think that it might be useful to try to understand which abilities are innate and which are acquired, and how are we actually engaging with others in terms of disabilities, because I think narratives play an important role in all of those views. So a full account of theory of mind should actually account for our ability to comprehend and produce narratives. So in theory, one theorizes about the other person, employs a theoretical stance in order to understand the other's mind, like a child scientist. Of course, it's an oversimplification, but for the sake of time, I'll just try to briefly go into all of them. Simulation theory one does not theorize about the other person, but instead uses one's own mental experiences as an internal model in order to understand the other's mind. So I simulate the feelings I would experience if I were in the situation of the other. Theory of mind module, different modules that help us attribute beliefs to other people. It's like a specialized component of social cognition. Then we have folk psychology, which we talked about extensively yesterday, versus the narrative practice hypothesis, about which Hero talked about yesterday as well. So with theory, there's how do narratives fit into that? Well, theory assumes that we come up with actually real theories about how other people act for reasons. Now, what a theory would entail is that we can generalize those principles and apply them to most of the contexts that are similar to that one. And this does not always seem to be the case. For example, if we go to the airport and we are actually waiting for someone that we haven't that we have never seen in real life, but we have like an idea of how that person is supposed to look, right? We are going to see someone waving at us, right? So if I were to derive the principle that someone waving at me means that it's signaling something to me, I could somehow generalize that and say, okay, so that's the person. But there are multiple reasons why persons could wave. So just using extracting a generalized principle from that might not work in here. So the best way, I think, to make sense of such situations is to come up with a narrative understanding of what's happening there. Simulation theory does not actually come against the idea of using narratives to understand other people, but there can be, of course, more understanding others narratively is a rather complex task. So it's entails doing multiple other things. So the most basic form might entail some sort of a simulation at a basic level. So I can look at the facial expressions. There can be intersubjective ways of interacting with others that are emerge prior to our ability to derive or to produce narratives that will help us make sense of other people's reasons. But this could be complementary. So now producing narratives and making sense of other people's reasons with those narratives can be complementary to simulation theory. Now, the biggest problem seems to be with the theory of mind module, because the theory of mind entails that there's some sort of specialized component of social cognition. And if this is the case, then if we have an innate predisposition to engage with others, and at some developmental stage, the full module simply comes online, and we are able to account for social cognition, then there's no role for narrative practices. But I think there's a way to go around that too. And the way to do that is to simply consider the ability to produce and to comprehend narratives, either a different module or just another manifestation of the same module, but with a different function. Perhaps it might not be the best way to go about it, but it could be. So I'll just try to explain the way that narrative practices are important for the inactivist views. Storytelling has various functions for Huda, not just entertainment. Stories are what we use to share experiences, to make connections with others, build trust, construct nerves for emotional connections. They also have normative functions. Narrative practice hypothesis is based on the idea that storytelling practices ground our ability to make sense of ourselves and others in terms of reasons, not my reading. He assumes that we are not born with the ability to make sense of others' mind or our own minds, and deems the modular theory of mind hypothesis his most important rival. However, simply assuming that the ability to ascribe mental states is not innate leaves open the possibility for other models such as theory. Huda argues against theory, and so does Gallagher. Narratives provide the way we come to make sense of actions done for reasons. And theory holds that we use folk psychology as some set of rules that we apply to explain the actions and mental lives of others. The rules are what make it a theory. Here's where Huda introduces his distinction between narrative versus causal understanding. So there's this quote: narratives and theories provide fundamentally different means for achieving fundamentally different ends. Theory is enlightened by focusing on what is abstract and law-bound, whereas narratives cast particulars in certain light to reveal the significance of what happens and why. For these reasons, general theories are simply non-narratives at all. Another view is that loose links between intentional states and subsequent action is the reason why narrative accounts cannot provide causal explanation. But the kind of narratives that are useful for the narrative practice should be according to the complex linguistic representations that describe a particular temporal sequence of non-logical related events, at least more than one, but usually a whole bunch. The event sequences that narratives describe can be real or functional. Another view is the interaction theory, where we don't need to have an understanding of other minds before engaging in meaningful interaction with others, because action comes first. And we start out as participants in a setting populated with other acting entities. By learning narrative practices and language, we engage in folk psychological ways of thinking about one another as persons. There's also those quotes from the two most important inactive views. So there's the idea of narrative competence that suggests an alternative to dumb approaches and a better way to account for the more sophisticated understandings and misunderstanding we have of others. And I completely agree to that. There's also the idea that there's a good deal of evidence that humans have from infancy onward direct perceptual access to the intentions and feelings of others in their embodied and situated comportment. Our primary way of understanding others is worked out not via third-person observation or first-person simulation, but by a second-person real interaction in pragmatic and social context. So, as I previously mentioned, I'm not going to come up with a solution or to a response to what narrative competence actually is. It's just rather an assumption, as I mentioned, it's a work in progress. So my idea is that what we should do is try to make sense of how we interact with others by also accounting for how we come to actually be able to engage in narrative competences. And we should understand what the cognitive prerequisites for narrative competence are. And probably we should do so without fully committing to inferentialist view or a fully inactive view. So the best way to make sense of it in my view, is to simply try to figure out what mechanisms are innate that help us produce narratives and help us comprehend them, and which abilities are actually acquired. So what does it mean to actually be able to use narratives to make sense of other people? How can we produce them? How can we make sense of narratives? So the earliest narrative-like attempts of very young children concern the recent past experiences. So by the time children are 5 or 6, they may be very proficient at telling both personal narratives and elaborate fantasy narratives. But they also seem to engage in pretend play, or they can talk to imaginary friends. So they seem to somehow be practicing and prepping for this major ability to produce narratives. And they practice by routines and play and reminiscing. And the role of the caregiver seems to be very important in here. So by routines, I mean simply going to sleep at a certain hour, or eating and noticing how this actually unfolds. So we have an event that is made up by several sequences. So someone sets the table, and then they bring the plates, and then the food, and then this is going to be routine for lunch. So I would say that this is actually non-linguistic narrative, but it has a major role in further developing a narrative competence that's more complex and language based. There's also play, when we engage in playful behavior with other children or dogs or whatever, other pets or dolls, we also somehow engage in a form of nonverbal narrative. I mean, babies can use utterances and those utterances can suffice for them to understand that that sequence of events as a single narrative episode. But that is because I believe that the prerequisites necessary for narrative competence are dependent on organizing experiences into units. So before we develop the ability to produce stories or to understand them, we have to first be able to sequence our experiences into smaller units. And then we have to bind the experience into coherent units, which makes it easier for us to remember them. It seems that we do have a predisposition to actually account for what we experience in terms of narrative, but we can only test that when we have the ability to talk. There's no way to look into that without it. And then we need to have episodic memory. Without it, we cannot have narrative competence. And there are also other abilities that seem to co-develop with it, like making future projections or labeling. So this might become accessible in a situation in which similar cues or sequences of events occur, so we can recognize a narrative. All these point to other important abilities, for example, planning or making identity statements. I used to be this, or I used to be that, whereas now I am something else. They're useful for norm formations, or for, I think, also for learning new concepts, because there's no way to actually, that's why I said that narrative competence is also important in learning other languages, because we need to get the background information about the concept that's introduced. We cannot simply learn a definition for it and work from there. So arguing that social cognition is entirely inferential or inactive tends to rather close lines of inquiry in as opposed to opening more and helping us make more sense of how it is that narratives play such an important role in our lives. So that's about it, but probably I'll just explain more in the Q&A section. Yes.
All right, thank you, sir.
Well, sure. I think Professor Hadow, I think you have a question.
Yes. Hi, thanks, Sandra. Thank you. Yeah. So I find that was a lot of material to cover. And it's interesting. But let me focus on the meta claim. So I guess one question I have for you, if we come back to the punchline at the end, which is, focusing either on the inferential or the inactive, is going to close down lines of inquiry. I think that's absolutely true, but I don't think we want to keep all lines of inquiry open forever. So I don't think anyone does, right? So there's going to be points of conflict. We won't make much progress by just pumping out lots and lots of different possibilities. And then, especially where those will contradict at some point, right? So, and let me take a neutral example just as a comment, right? So we won't make progress if we don't decide, go back to the old days of the simulation theory hybrids. When you really analyze those debates, if you want to understand folk psychology using their material, you're going to have to decide between which one of those was the core of folk psychology and which were peripheral. So again, somebody could argue that, in fact, I mean, on some general notional term, that it will be better off if we keep every possibility alive. But if we do that, then we really won't know how to make sense of what's driving what you were describing as mechanisms. I think one of the things here too is that some of the dominant mainstream ways of thinking about the mind are committed to cognitive mechanisms as such, and activists not so much, right? They don't even think in terms of mechanisms. So I would have said that I agree with you that we do need to understand some of these features, and indeed some of the empirical work that we find in these different areas would be very important. But the philosophical or the frameworks that we use, we're going to have to hammer out which we think are the more plausible, and there the devil will be in the detail. So I'm just going to make a comment about some of this. I mean, this very week I'll be talking about why I think, as standardly defined, episodic memories may not exist prior to narrative capacities. And the reason for that is that the usual definition is that they're going to have to be personal, particular representations of someone's an event in the past. If we look at some of the more emerging accounts of what's possible, it may turn out that in some of the data you were talking about, why the mechanism, even when you describe them as mechanisms, why is it that, as simulationists have argued, why is it that we both seem to use the same mechanism for future thinking as well as past thinking? And indeed, whether it's plausible to think that if we really look at more developed predictive processing views, why it might be that, in fact, we're not really trying to capture past events. The reconstructive character might be just that, well, actually, we're trying to get tendencies or possibilities, right? So once you start to work that through, it might turn out that you come to think that there's reason to prefer one account over the other, and you might start to pull away from one. So I'm just giving this as a very broad example because it's a meta point, right? I'm not trying to say that that's decided, but I do think that's the only way we're going to make progress on those questions. I don't think we should actually say, well, you know, we should keep all those things going, or there's necessarily going to be a better account if we put them together. That, all of that said, I don't even want to deny that there's possibility for inference making. I think that's something we have to explain, but I don't think that happens at the roots of cognition. So it's a rather complicated story about how you'd put this together. So I just wanted to maybe press you a little bit to say, why do you think necessarily that it's good to keep those two lines of inquiry wide open when they might in fact come into conflict?
Right. So the reason why I argued for keeping all of them open was until we actually come up to an understanding of how we actually develop this ability to produce and comprehend narratives. Because I do believe that at the root of social cognition, there is this practice of engaging with narrative practice. This is what it's helping us make sense of other people's feelings. But I also don't want to give up the idea that there might be situations where we actually have to use inferential methods, right? So I'm trying to see if this ability to produce narratives is actually something that both views might actually use in order to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make one last comment and I'll come back and then move on. But just to say, like, take your example of the Tom mechanism, and you were saying, well, if you posit it and then posit it with different functions, right, then maybe it could be playing some part in the story. I think there are really strong arguments for not believing in that, right? Now, of course, that doesn't silence the possibility of defenders coming back and reviving positions. That's lost a lot of steam, but people might wish to come back and trying to defend it. Recently in the BBS, after a long time, somebody's trying to revive Fodor's language of thought. So it's not like people won't stop making these arguments, but actually, I don't think we have necessarily, when we review the arguments themselves, good reason to believe in these things. So there might be actually a better benefit in thinking instead of just what might be possible, what's a coherent, full-fledged framework in its totality? I mean, that's, as a philosopher, that's what I think we're doing. I'm not a cognitive scientist, but I do think we can review the widest possible range of reasons for thinking we should not prefer this explanation over. That's what I tried to give in the talk yesterday. So I think it's not just a neutral positioning. Of course, there's a wide literature you could draw from, but then you might not be able to make it very coherent if you don't do that background philosophical spade work.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have to give this a lot of thought. As I previously mentioned, it was highly exploratory. So I'm trying to make sense of narrative competence, and I'll give it a lot of thought. But thank you for your input. I believe there is another question from Susanna Rucinska. Is that okay? I think I have to.
Yeah, thank you, Andrei. There was a lot in your presentation, a lot of information, and I just want to talk to you about the non-linguistic narratives, because you mentioned them, and I just have kind of a question. Since you're interested in narrative practices, narrative competence, when we speak of narrative practices, right? They're going to be not only linguistic, they're very much verbal and expressed, right? So I know you were exploring a big territory, and I wonder what exactly you want to do with the non-linguistic narratives. So three things that come to my mind, right? Like one, you did talk about that possibility is a sequence of connected events, right? It's separate, and it can be separated, not connected to language. If that's the case, I wonder what that means about, I don't know, non-animal humans, non-human animals, this way around. Can they engage in narratives? What would that exactly mean? Two, I did like your story about children's pretend play and how they explore certain routines. And the way you characterized it would be to say, oh, it's a non-linguistic narrative that plays a role in the development of a linguistic narrative. I'm not quite sure what it does for us to say that it's a non-linguistic narrative. I'm not sure what that means, because we could just say it's a certain routine, it's certain habits that children have. And it would be very interesting to explore the connection between habits and explicit narratives. So I'm not sure what it does to call them non-linguistic narratives yet. And finally, I really liked your very first slide, which was what are narratives good for, right? The very first slide that you gave. And you talk about entertainment, learning languages, cultivating norms, communicating with others, and sharing experiences. And of course, all these things you can only do when you're talking about verbal, explicit, linguistic narratives. So going back to the start, if you allow this possibility of non-linguistic narratives, what exactly would they be good for? That's my question.
Right. So what I initially had in mind was that sometimes we engage in playful behavior with non-human animals, right? So we actually can develop like personalized games or something of the sort. Right. So the way we are doing this is not by, so for example, if we have like a deaf dog that cannot hear us, it's useless for us to talk to him anyway. But what we can do is that we can actually use objects in our environment and create like a sort of story-like sequence of events based on those objects, right? So we would actually have a visual narrative that is going to drive the the engagement instead of having one that is based on language. Also, with babies, the thought was in the same area. So when we actually engage with people, of course, we don't only use our narrative practices, we use a lot of other capacities, such as following their eyes, their gaze, interacting with them. So we get a lot from the interaction. And babies usually tend to engage in a lot of such practices with their mothers in their first years of development. So my thoughts were that they were using the same sort of visual narratives in there before they acquire linguistic capacities. And that is something that further helps them after they develop their linguistic capacities, of course, to become better at understanding other people's intentions and come up with reasons why. I'm not saying that at that stage they can explain the behavior of others, but at least visually they are training somehow to make sense of it in a minimum way.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think that's a decent answer, right? The idea that through the visuals only, it's like a visual narrative that allows us to drive the event, to understand better. But in general, in philosophy of mind and of our theories, we don't talk about philosophy of mind as image making or image sharing, right? It's because we're learning language in school and not how to draw better. It's all about, of course, verbal narratives. So I think that's kind of getting that point stronger across. It's also very interesting. So thank you.
Thanks. I think Katalin.
Yes, so very nice talk, Sandra. So I would like to ask for a clarification. So you are discussing about maybe narrative competencies as being a separate cognitive mechanism, and then you pointed to an investigation that we may do, for example, to try to understand when this competence is getting formed, looking at the children, right, when they tend to acquire these competencies. And then this may be used, of course, by acquiring these competencies. Then we have the theory of mind competence. And then this may be used maybe to reject the idea that there is a module that allows us to perform a TOM. But I'm wondering if they appear at the same time, right? If when we acquire narrative competencies, then we have the TOM capabilities. Why is not, I mean, what makes us to say that it's not the other way around, that actually there is a module and this is how we acquire narrative competencies? Because in the end, they happen at the same time. So my question is, did you went so far to identify maybe some neuroscientific evidence on these accounts, or is just at the beginning of the investigation?
Right, so it's the beginning. I've looked for it in the literature, so there hasn't been much research into what's the underlying neural mechanisms for providing narratives. Most of them are actually based on producing and understanding language, right? So there's a difficulty there, but there's a thing. It might be the case that they actually co-developed. Right, but the idea was that a theory of mind module simply does not seem to explain how is it that at a certain developmental age we simply magically get this ability to fully comprehend other people's reasons. So it feels like this ability to engage with narratives and make use of them, it's necessary to jump from some of the primary innate modules, such as intentionality detector or following gaze, and those two might be needed for narrative competence. but actually narrative competence in combination with language is what actually allows us to further engage in social interaction with others. It might be the case that they simply develop at the same time, okay? And then it's not going to help very much because we would not be able to very well distinguish between them. However, I do know that there are some tests that are being developed for narrative abilities, and there's this idea of using those tests at the same time with false belief tests, so that we can better understand what it is that the false belief tests are actually testing when we're saying that they simply have no mentalizing abilities. There's also the triangle animation. I don't know if you know it. So the thought is that when we are looking at those animations with the triangles, what we're actually doing is simply ascribing some narratives to those movement. That's where we're telling actually a story about those. It's not that we're actually having if you are unable to do that, it's not that we have the inability to mentalize. It's just that we're not using a lot of mental concepts when we are coming up with those stories. So yeah, it could be the case that it's not going to lead in the direction that I'm hoping.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thanks. Raluca?
Hi, Sandra. Did you find any studies that correlate emotional intelligence with narrative competence?
So I didn't look into it specifically, but I do think that somehow our ability to grasp the emotions of others and such are embedded somehow within the narrative. So actually they should co-develop, I think.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Hearing you, that's what came to my mind. That it must be the competence of narratives must be a trait of emotional intelligence, especially when you were talking about autism. Maybe that would point out the trait of narrative competence in emotionally intelligent people.
So I think this would rather help make sense of how we actually can understand other perspectives. So it might be helpful because we're training to switch perspectives, and in this sense, I'm not sure about emotion comprehension, where that might be. I haven't looked into it, but it's a good idea. It's worth looking into.
Thank you, Sandra. The presentation was great.
Thanks. So, okay, just, okay. I cannot see any other hand, but also I cannot see the other people.
Okay. So, quick question. Following the answer. Do you think that the fact that we are telling our children tales of fairy tales comes into their narrative?
We cannot hear. Can the person comes? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I will ask Steph to come.
You can repeat my question, please. So telling stories and fairy tales to our children will contribute their education in narrative competence.
Yes, so I do believe that the role of the caregivers in our ability to develop narrative competency is very important, because our caregivers are the ones who are going to engage us with those narrative practices. They're going to, as I previously mentioned, there's going to be the routines. They're going to talk. They'll talk to us. They'll come up with stories, help us remember past events. They will narrate our past events. So I took you to the kitchen, and you take them to the kitchen, and then you tell them stories. Of course, if you telling stories to children is a great way to develop.
Would be possible for them to develop this kind of competencies
Without, I think they might, but it might take longer. So the developmental stage might be a little bit more extended, more,
and
will look different.
We would have to replace the fairy tales with other experiences. What that kind of
To
experience-
replace the fairy tales
the
with,
fairy tales with other experience.
as in,
I don't know. If they miss their education, the fairy tales, the children miss their education, the fairy tales, how can we replace that? With what we replace that?
yeah, well, that's a good question. So apparently there are different cultures, right? So they might have different narrative practices. So they could have, we may use some sort of stories like, I don't know, fables or stuff
You
like
know
that. But
there is a quite a well-known thing that fairy tales are present in any culture.
yes, but the way that those fairy tales are used to engage others are different. So they don't have the same characteristics, right? So when you're asking me what would we replace them with, well, it depends, because there's a variety. There are different ways to come up with stories. So if you don't have fables, then there's no problem. You can have other kind of fictional stories. You can have stories about agents that can account for, I don't know, for nature, right? And you can come up with a story about how
Yes,
trees
that's
communicate
something
with.
that's- of course.
Right, so-
But they're, let's say they're all covered by this umbrella concept of fairy tales, so imaginary facts.
Right, so you're asking me if there are other ways to compensate for the lack of a caregiver engaging you with fictional narratives.
Humanity lacking the fairy tales, or losing it.
Okay.
We will still have an act.
Well, yes, we would, but probably it will, I mean, the age at which we might develop it might look different, because we would engage with other people, right? We would play with other children. When we play, we seem to have this tendency of accounting for our experiences in terms of narratives. So there is this chance that we might engage in pretend play, and this might also be a way for us to train this competence. There's also other ways we can do that. You can simply, you don't want to read stories or fables and stuff like that. There are other kinds of narratives that you can actually use that do have references to social agents, or to to agents that actually have reasons for doing stuff. No problem.
Just a follow-up on what you were saying. If we speak about those fairy tales that we tell the children, I think it's impossible to eliminate them, even if we do a mental exercise, because all those fairy tales are basically our mythologies, and they make the culture. So it would be, I think, impossible just to imagine what would happen without them. And the thing that I wanted to ask about, because it's sort of a curiosity and maybe you can shed some light on it. There's a common practice of parents of very young children to narrate the actions that they are doing with the children. Like, let's go take a bath, now we are eating. How much does this practice of narration helps in developing narrative content?
So there have been studies that have shown that parents who actually narrate common events throughout the house, they tend to be better at the present tense. Yes, they tend to be actually better at passing the false belief test, which does not necessarily entail that they have a narrative competence. But if you are trying to look at the false belief test in terms of coming up with stories about what's going on in there, and you also take into account the role of interaction, because what's happening there is that you have, right, so you have an instructor, and the instructor is talking to you, right, and telling you that you have two objects, and those objects are going to do some things, and then you are supposed to track the perspective of those objects. You would have to infer mental states to them. But in my view, what you're actually doing is coming up with a story about what's happening based on your interaction with the instructor. So if you do have a lot of practice with people narrating stuff to you, it might be easier for you to understand what is actually asked of you. So you might try to practice the same thing. So when the doll is actually going away, you might, if she cues this to you, so where is she looking now? They are not doing this, but if they were to do this, where is the doll looking now? What's her perspective? What does she think now? What's happening now? This might actually help you pass. So there's conflicting results on that. I'll tell you that they tried several ways of modifying the false belief test. So we have the Duplo. I can send you a lot of derivations from there.
Because
So
I was thinking, you said about theory of mind efficiencies, especially with the example regarding children in autism spectrum. So maybe could be a very good therapeutical tool to narrate more than usual to children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders.
I believe Professor Hutto has something about the role of narrative practices in healthcare, and probably he could tell you more about that if you. So the question was if
you could transform this, let's say, normal parenting skills, or whatever you want to call it, narrative skills, into therapeutical tools, either for children or for the adults, because
right.
My next question would be, okay, you were not exposed this kind of narrations from your parents when you were in some stages of your development. So if you are exposed to the same things when you are 20, it's useless. So what should you be exposed to then?
Right. So yeah, I do believe that they can be used as therapeutical tools, and you can develop several ways of modifying, I don't know, making them easier for them to follow specific perspective taking. But Professor Hood, I think, will like to intervene and tell you more about how the role of narratives in healthcare practices.
Well, there's lots of, thank you, Sandra, for inviting me in on that. There are lots of different ways that narratives can be used, but they have, Carol Gray has used individualized stories for autistic individuals to help them better regulate behavior. That's work that was done back in the 90s. There's been, usually used to be billed under mentalizing, but actually I think it's arguable that when you look closely at it, and there's been some new work on that in borderline personality disorders, training people, to better have a narrative competency in understanding others and how to ascribe mental states through that. If I'm right, not through training, you're not training, for example, it's not plausible that you're training a subpersonal module at that point, right? So you're not putting a patch inside a subpersonal mechanism, and indeed what they do is very person level kind of adjustments. So yes, I mean, ordinary people, and then come back to the previous the example that we talked about, empathizing. in everyday life, right? So even more broadly, you might think that developing narrative competencies and strengthening them will help you with ordinary tasks of better relating to co-workers, colleagues, spouses, and such like. So, you know, there's actually quite a lot of scope, but you're right. There's very specific forms of narrative therapy as well. So I think there's actually a wide range of ways that you can, as that example those cases give, there's like a lot of places where developing what we describe as a narrative competence might make a difference to, as you say, mental health.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? Or I guess not.
If not, please join us in thanking Sandra. All right, thanks so much to all. And this wraps up this morning's panel. And we'll reconvene at 5 minutes to 5 p.m. local time. Thanks for being here, and I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. Cheers.